So thank you for coming. Thank you for being able to the Office of Research for putting all this stuff together. Great, great folks. So I don't know how you operate, but I'm thinking all the time about these things. And I was thinking on my bicycle this morning coming up here, why am I interested in violence? And I really hadn't thought about that before. And then I realized today is Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I realized my whole life has been affected by violence. So I thought in that context, introduce you to my family. These are my paternal grandmother's brothers, sisters and brother, and their family and children and grandchildren. And of this group of people in Amsterdam in 1939, celebrating my great-grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary, only one person, the young woman at the very corner there, survived. So of this picture, one person. All the rest of them died in Auschwitz. And, you know, I guess this is why I'm interested in violence. And in a sense, riding my bicycle out here this morning, I realized what I'm going to be talking about today around environmental violence and the approaches that we could take to environmental violence is actually, I'm speaking at Oak Bay High School in a couple of weeks, and I hadn't thought of connecting these two things, but it's going to be a real easy connection. So violence is really a piece of what's affected my life, and I guess that's why I ended up talking about it. But I hadn't thought about it until I just put this slide in this morning, so I realized I didn't know why I do this. I know that the work I've done since the mid-1970s, early 1970s in environmental education really is a reflection of violence. And in fact, the very field of environmental education, I think, really grows out of a sense of violence. It grows out of a sense right from its beginning days in the early 70s of something was wrong. And people who were writing in these early days, 1971, Clay Schoenfield, who wrote the first editorial for the first journal of environmental education, talked about this kind of stuff, this misdevelopment, this increasing levels of bad things that are even threatening the pursuit of happiness itself. The problem is that the word violence never shows up in the environmental education literature. It literally doesn't appear at all, anyplace. In the founding documents during the days with UNESCO and the UN Environmental Program, it doesn't show up. In the 20 years later, in Thessaloniki, when again this group of people internationally came together, it doesn't show up. It's the term never shows up. The concept sits below it, but the term really doesn't appear. And that really surprised me because it's violence that's really causing the planet in a way to, you know, we're doing things that are not very good. We hear regularly about existential risks, and many of these existential risks are due to uncontrolled environmental violence. Tainter's classic book on the collapse of complex societies lays out these 11 factors, but the first one is about resources. It's about when we commit violence against the world, complex societies can fall apart. And we know complex societies don't last for long times. The average is 336 years. And here we are, in the middle of a time where we have people in scholarship thinking about the end, thinking about existential crisis. So I began to get interested in violence. Now, this could be a little gross to some, so I'm warning you, but, you know, is this violence? You know, and I would argue, no, this female lion is not really about violence per se, right? One traditionally would say that violence implies conscious intent of a perpetrator to harm. Now, I'm not going to go with that. Harm is going to stay, but conscious intent is not going to persist in my understanding of what violence is. You know, you could ask the question, is this violence? Shooting this lion, this famous lion, was that violence? Or is this violence? Or is Jason Kenney talking about violence in terms of the expansion of the Alberta tar sands? Is this violence? That the work of Jim Hansen and his group looking at what's been going on in the last little while around global CO2 levels and global temperatures. Is this violence? And I'm going to argue that, yeah, this is violence. Now, this is how the World Health Organization looks at violence, that it's, again, they look at violence as being intentional. Right? Violence is something with an intent that someone does against another group that results in harms. Variety of harms there. And maybe somewhat congruent with that, a little bit different, is Emmanuel Levinas, the great French philosopher, and I like this idea, that violence is to be found in any action in which one acts as if one were alone to act, right? That the rest of the world doesn't matter. That's an understanding of action. Or as a fellow who's just written an interesting book on climate change, when we behave as if we're the only ones that matter and ignoring everything else. That's a form of violence. But the analysis of violence that I've really come to appreciate, and it's one of the reasons I love working at Royal Roads, because you get to hang out with people who know all of this stuff, and I just have to stumble upon it because I describe myself as an omnivore. I'm always looking for interesting things to eat. And peace and violence research, which Ken Christie eats all the time, has been really an interesting new meal for me. Johan Galtung talks about violence in a different way. He talks about it as an avoidable insult to human needs. Avoidable. He doesn't talk about intent. He says, and generally in his later writings, to sentient life of any kind, lowering the real level of need satisfaction. That is, we have all needs, the Maslowian type needs that have to be, that we want to fulfill. He says, lowering them below what is potentially possible. So they all give a variety of lenses through which we can understand violence. But for me, I'd like the Galtung idea, although the Levinasian idea also appeals. And so he talks about these, Galtung talks about these kinds of needs that we all have to survive. And when we don't allow survival needs, a negation of that is death, or misery, or repression, or alienation. And violence, then, can be something in a Galtungian way that increases alienation, actions that negate our ability to find meaning in our own lives. Well, what Galtung talks about is a few different kinds of violence. And he says, violence, clearly, there are actors who cause violence. I come up to someone, I take a swipe at them, I've caused direct violence. But he also, and this is the part that was the revelation for me, was he talks about structural violence. And I'll look at each one of these. That there's a system. Systems create violence. They churn out harm. They cause human needs deficits. And it can be completely unintended. And we usually don't see that. So he calls that structural violence, and then he talks about cultural violence. That is, a culture can legitimize direct violence and structural violence. So in a sense, going back to my family's picture, there was a culture that legitimized direct violence against all those people. They were all taken away, gassed, and burned. There was structural pieces of it that allowed that to happen without causing much grief on the part of individuals involved in the structure, bureaucrats, etc. So this is how Galtung sees violence: direct, structural, and cultural. And they all are very applicable to my work as an environmental educator. He says the direct violence is very visible, and that's often where we put our energies. We put our energies towards dealing with the visible forms of violence. But it's the invisible forms that really allow and facilitate the direct visible violence. So while we focus on what's visible, we tend to not ask the questions of the relationships between structures of systems, social systems, and cultures, and the way they facilitate each other and the way they facilitate direct violence. So we have an invisible form of violence which needs to be revealed. So I've always felt that our jobs as educators, maybe the most important job that we have as educators, is to work to reveal things that are hidden, that we're not just about promulgating information. We should be providing tools to help reveal things that are hidden. At the same time, we have to be open to revelation ourselves, which is what happens when you get good students. But we need to have vehicles to understand what's hidden. And systems, I think Royal Roads was very advanced in its outset by having systems thinking and systems analysis as a core part of virtually all of our programs. So direct violence, then, while we can think of it in direct personal violence, Galtung has this kind of stuff. Direct violence can involve, killing, maiming, sanctions, can involve these kinds of things. And he notes that there's non-human nature too. When we destroy biota, when we destroy whole ecosystems, we are committing direct violence. And this is what we do. But direct violence is, forget about this, I'm going past that. This is kind of direct violence, right? It's directly hurting people. It's directly hurting biota in the case of environmental things. The slaughter of the pilot whales in China, clear-cut logging in central Vancouver Island, grizzly bear trophy hunting, and something that I've experienced teaching every 2 years in China with our master's program, having to wear masks. Direct violence. People in China are very aware of their children's lives being affected by air quality like that. Direct violence. But we see that. What we don't see is the structural violence that allows these larger acts of direct violence to occur. So this is a map of the Mississippi River going down to New Orleans. You can see down there in the lower side of the picture. And this is called Cancer Alley. Maybe you've heard of this. Cancer Alley. So it outlines both where the petrochemical plants are, where you've had large amounts of soil displacements, and where the plants have expanded, and you have these colored grays and darker grays, purplish things, which really look at things like the percent of the population living below poverty, and then the blue circles are emission releases. This is an area where no one gets old. In these small, and these are mainly black, poor communities where no one gets old because everyone dies of cancer. This is structural violence. It's the result of human systems that cause no one, the petrochemical companies don't intend to cause violence, but it's what we do. It's what they do. The point of the system isn't to kill people, but the point of the system is that it kills people. So, this is how, again, Galtung sees it. Violence without the clear subject-object relationship is structural. He points out one case is direct violence, but when 1 million husbands keep 1 million wives in ignorance, that's structural, and that's something we don't think about enough. The structural violence produces many victims, but who's responsible? Who's the perpetrator of this? You can't find a perpetrator. No one is by themselves responsible. We can, in a structurally violent situation, all of us can say, I didn't do anything wrong. I was following orders. I was just doing what the boss said. Here's the instruction book. Here's what the government allows me to do. The violence itself is invisible, or at least it's ignorable. The sweatshop thing, this idea of the power of the tyranny, as this fellow calls it, the tyranny of small decisions, right? We all make these little decisions about buying, T-shirts, and we end up with large problems of water, of resources, of pollution. It's not necessary, but it's just the way it is. It's what happens. And again, looking in the Galtung manner, we can look at the indirect or structural violence and how it affects, the survival needs. Well, no one is responsible for the poor people dying or starving or withering away, but it's what happens because the structure allows this to happen. And these things don't just disappear over time. Long after slavery was over in the Americas, its historical legacy is still quite alive, keeping the great-great-great-grandchildren of ex-slaves still subservient in many ways to the great-great-great-grandchildren of slave owners. It hides, structural violence hides in the background, and it diverts our attention away from it. And this is the one I think we need to be looking at, and I'm encouraging teachers to take this kind of seriously. This is the kind of violence that Hannah Arendt describes when she talks about a bureaucracy as an intricate system of bureaus in which no men, neither one nor the other, neither the few nor the many, can be held responsible, and which could probably be called rule by nobody. No one intended to create the ozone layer. The hole in the ozone layer, which is what's demonstrated there. But nonetheless, that was an outcome of our industrial civilization. So direct violence was easy to get. Structural violence takes more analytical skill to identify the structure and see the violence. And then, I have colleagues in environmental education in Alberta, who become part of things like the Canadian Oil Sands Education Program, and teachers go off and they learn all sorts of things about the oil sands, free, all expenses paid, sponsored by these guys. Cenovus, they're committed to being responsible developer of one of Canada's most valuable resources, or Encana, or Suncor. So these are, by many people's assessment, some of the most violent companies in terms of structural violence that you might have on the planet. But we normalize structural violence and say this is the way it is. Of course we're going to take oil out. We just had an election in Alberta that was fostering this kind of way of thinking. And the way that structural violence gets normalized and we can engage in what Albert Bandura, the social psychologist, talks about as moral disengagement, is we legitimize these violent behaviors through what Galton calls cultural violence. That we have ways of justifying, legitimizing direct or structural violence, allowing us to not feel at all that we're doing anything wrong. Because we're not doing anything wrong. Everyone is doing what we're involved in. Science is involved in this. I mean, the anthropological stuff. Who's the perfect human there up at the top, and the chimps and Negroes, lesser creatures. Is this an example of cultural violence at the World Economic Forum? Talking about sustainable economic growth. That's maybe another way of talking about cultural violence. And when I finish, I'll tell you my looniest new project, which involves the stock markets. But what's interesting, it makes cultural violence makes this direct and structural violence look right. And the way Galton describes it is, we can change the moral valence, and that's what my little project is about at the end, from wrong to right. And he would point out that you can't go out and kill someone, but you can kill someone that your country can tell you to go out and kill. It's changing the moral valence. You're a murderer or you're a patriot. Cultural violence allows structural and direct violence to look and feel right, or at least not wrong. This, right? This is we're in this together. We're in this together is a message about This is our culture. We're all in this together. And we all have a stake in getting the pipeline expanded. And as citizens, we'll all benefit from the jobs and increased revenue. And as owners of the pipeline, we'll all profit from our investment. This is cultural violence. So now I should talk about environmental education, I guess. But, just to, again, point out, we're all part of this, right? We all are complicit in this. We all, I biked here this morning. You probably biked here this morning. But, otherwise we're all burning fossil fuels to get here. Like, if we live in the suburbs where they may not have any transit, or you may have health issues, or a lot of reasons why there's no way around using a car. Direct violence. And it's, we've designed our society in Canada so that cars are really our necessity. So there's a structural violence, and everyone does it. So, it's not too bad. It's cultural violence. And so we need to mine oil, create tailings, build pipelines, and ship product. And as we just saw in the Alberta election, some of us get angry when we can't engage in this kind of economic and environmental violence and elect governments that promise us that they're going to help shield our consciousness from the implications of these actions. I found this great quote from Voltaire, but I bet he wrote it in French. But I'll only have the English translation, where he said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." I thought that's a really interesting insight. It goes back to my first slide, of course, of believing those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That was really kind of interesting. So rather than now spending a lot of stuff on, and the language of violence, just in that context, what does Premier Kenney said first thing he's going to do is create a war room. Right? It's violent language. He's going to push back. He's going to attack the environmental communities. It's very violent language that gets used. And I've also learned, being an omnivore, which you may be interested in, is there's a whole new domain called green criminology, which I had never heard of until about 4 or 5 days ago, where they explore social and environmental harms done by environmentally violent actors and actions. It's very interesting. And the two lead people in this, they say, for example, this is a quote, "The discovery that the average person is either thousands, tens of thousands, or billions of times more likely to suffer from environmentally induced violent victimization compared to acts of street crime violence should startle even green criminologists," and they've done that kind of analysis. Okay, so environmental education. So what I've done, I've proposed 3 approaches that educators, I'm talking K-12 type educators, can do with their students to confront the reality of environmental violence in all its forms, direct, structural, and cultural. Talked about nonviolence. And this whole paper began a few years ago when I was invited to speak at a conference on Gandhian nonviolence. And I realized violence just was missing in environmental education. And then I've had to make up two terms. So I'm talking about nonviolence, anti-violence, and contra-violence. And if you can help me with better words, I'll be really happy. So I want to go through those. So, environmental nonviolence, harvesting orange roughy, these are 70, 80-year-old fish. They were big in the supermarkets for a while. It's like mining them. They were taking these huge stocks of very old fish, and now, they're basically fished out. There's a lot of ways we can engage in nonviolent activity. We don't buy we don't buy fish that are being mined as opposed to sustainably harvested. We can engage in no dumping our oil wastes. That's nonviolence. Buying forest certified sustainable FSC. Charles, what's the FSC? Sorry. Forest Stewardship Council, yeah. You can buy that. You can get on your bike every morning. These are nonviolent activities. When I come here, it's a nonviolent activity by choice. I'm not burning my carbon. And we can do things with our students. at a variety of levels, schools can engage in environmentally nonviolent things, like we can, go out and walk to school. We can ice skate to school. We can bicycle to school. We can do a lot of things. Transportation has the greenhouse gas contribution in Canada of transportation is almost identical to the gas and oil industry. So if we can help to reduce that level of greenhouse gas emissions through reducing the need for burning fossil fuels to move kids around, that would be a very good thing. It's a real good thing to do. And it's easy if there's no structures in the way. Like, there is no school. You have to go 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers to get to school. We can do these we can decide to eat lower on the food chain. That's an environmentally nonviolent action. We can simply reuse stuff. I use my brother's and my late father-in-law and father's clothes because I don't have to buy stuff and I'm cheap. Recycling, reusing, doing local stuff, organic stuff, burning fossils. There's a lot of things we could talk with students about. What is a form of environmental nonviolence and what can they do? That's the simple stuff. That's the obvious stuff that we can focus on. There's lots of nonviolent things that we can all engage with, and we should engage with, and that schools can engage with as well. But it's the invisible stuff that we have to do to work on. So I'd like to talk a little bit about anti-violence. So anti-violence will be working against environmental violence. And I think Greta here, who would have, we talk about black swans, right? Who would have imagined that this 16-year-old Swedish girl could come out of just sitting on the sidewalk in front of the parliament and electrify the world, really. But this is the work, the political work that gets done. Anti-violence, working against environmental violence. Friday, there's going to be another student strike here in Victoria. And if you're around, you might want to go down the ledge and see what's going on. But I think kids need to be supported in this, and this is something they need to learn about. How do you organize? How do you analyze systems so that you understand the structure, so you can actually deal with the structures that are causing environmental violence and then work against those structures, against those systems? This is all stuff we need to do. These are, once you start seeing systems are a revelatory tool. When you realize it's not just simple stuff, and we can engage our students in anti-violent things too, not just protests, but they can, bring communities together. We can encourage engaged and active citizenship. We can help young people learn, how do you organize? How do you build awareness of people? How do you collaborate with others to accomplish shared and important tasks? And how do you understand the system and look for the leverage spots, as Donella Meadows, the great systems thinker, spoke of? How do you find the leverage spots to make change? And that's something schools should not be afraid to do. And then I'd like to just finish with the other side, which is the contra-violence. So I couldn't think of a word. Contra means like opposite to. And I couldn't think of a good word. So I was kind of stuck. So if you have a better word, I'm really open to it. But the idea is, how do we make amends? In the Jewish tradition, we talk about tikkun olam, or the healing or the repair of the world. We know the world is broken. We know that we're all involved in it. And we also know that none of us can fix it. There's a rabbinical teaching from in a volume called The Wisdom of the Fathers. It's one of the rabbis say that you're not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. So it's not that we have to solve the problems of the world, but we need to be part of the solution. And I think, again, with teachers and students and families and communities, we can work at amends, repair, restitution. So a wonderful Christian scholar who talks about ecological restoration as being a form of public spiritual practice, right? Because there's a deeper piece. It's not just science. It's not just digging ditches. It's actually a form of amend being made in contra-violent activity. So, there's all sorts of contra-violent activity. You can, this is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, right? Picking up plastics. There's this Greta Van Vierens, the scholar I was just mentioning. How do we work against it? How do we, clean up, restore, replant, plantings, putting in trees, picking up plastics. There's all sorts of stuff that can be done around restoration ecology, which I think is really important to do. And we can do this with kids in schools. Even little kids can see their role in healing and being engaged in the reversal, even in a minuscule and tiny way, of the violence that we're all complicit in. Eric Higgs, a friend who was head of the School of Environmental Studies at UVic, is a real underrated paper of his, because it was really a beautiful piece. There's a spiritual dimension to it, but the title I like, A Quantity of Engaging Work to be Done. And I think it's engaging work to be involved in ecological restoration. Why the various scholars talk about, why should we be involved? Well, we have prudential considerations, that we have obligations. And it's prudent to undertake these acts of amends to protect existing natural areas, and in as much as they're under continuous threat of violence. But also, along with the prudential concern, that there, in a sense, we live in a world where compensatory justice really is important. We reciprocate. And this is a form of reciprocation, recognizing that maybe these damaged places have a claim on our actions to undo the damage that we've done, even though we might not be personally responsible. And finally, that we think about the future. Probably some of you had the same responses to, seeing the bumper sticker on motorhomes that said, "We're spending our children's inheritance," right? Deeply, deeply true. And so, if we have obligations to future generations, then both human, but maybe we have obligations to non-humans as well. But even if we're only thinking about the human obligations, ecological restoration and recreation creates better places for our children and our grandchildren. And it ties in really closely with religious communities. And I've done a lot of work and speaking with and working with church, not just spiritual, but church-based groups. So this is Greta Van Vieren's book. There's Islamic work, just in terms of the Abrahamic traditions. Rabbi Troster is in Philadelphia. These are all things we can do with students in schools. We can engage in ecological restoration. We can engage in invasive species removal. We could replant, rewild, and just encourage people to be outside more and develop more of that feeling of connection to the landscapes. Maybe you know this quote. This really has always been very moving. This is the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington. And I think many of us, as you get older, I've always felt, beware of older people saying the end is near, because for them the end is near, right? And so I'm aware of that in my own life. But here's where Martin Luther King used that term that Barack Obama used, now confronted with the fierce urgency of now. And I feel this, and I think a lot of people are feeling this fierce urgency of now. And that last line about, over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, "too late." So you have the IPCC saying, by 30 or so years from now, we've really got to be pretty much decarbonized. But it's not like we can do it the year before, right? Because by the year before, it is too late. And this piece by King in 1967, this was a year almost exactly before he was killed, is very poignant to me. And of course, I don't want to preach despair, right? So maybe have a little. Is it slowly moving? All right, the hell with it. Let's try one more time. Let's try one more time. Oh. Well, it is kind of fun. And it's just about this hashtag ocean optimism is really interesting. My friend, Janine's friend, Ellen Kelsey, one of our associate faculty, has been associate faculty for a long time, lives here now in Victoria. She's done a lot of writing around this idea. Of course, Ellen is, you can just look at her. I mean, she is an optimistic person, right? This is who she is. But it's, you know, as one of my friends at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education said in the early 90s, he said, as educators, despair is not our business. And I think Edmund O'Sullivan was right. So, but optimism isn't the word I would use, because optimism is like the philosopher in Pangloss in Voltaire's novel Candide. Pangloss is always saying, as he's being ripped apart by dogs that, or being impaled on things. I mean, Pangloss, and he's always saying, but this is the best of all possible worlds. That's what an optimist says. I'm not sure I want ocean optimism, but hope is something we have to work with. And so, again, when I work with kids, I don't want this to be them to be left in a state of despair. So to finish then, I think as we look at environmental education in the realm of violence, I first think we need to be able to use words to describe what we see. And beyond direct violence, I think we need to be able to speak of structural violence and cultural violence as being an important part of how we understand what's going on around us. And I think we can also offer to anyone, any group of young people, the idea of engaging in nonviolent activity, working against environmental violence, and trying to undo in a small way environmental violence. And so my last little quirky project. So this has been bugging me for a while. So this is really just happening right now. So, I wake up, alarm clock goes off at 6:30, hang around the bed for a little bit. 6:50, Gregor Craigie gets on CBC radio and reads the stock market report. And the stock market report says two things. It tells you what's going on in the economy, and it also tells you how you should feel about it, right? Because there's an emotional valence to up and down. Up is good. I'm up, right? Down, I'm depressed, miserable, and we have all these associations in our culture with up. And so when Gregor says that the TSX is up, I'm supposed to feel good, right? Even if I don't have anything in the stock market, I'm supposed to feel good. Times Colonist, up and down. 3 numbers, what the market is, the change from yesterday, and the percent change from yesterday. So what I've proposed to CBC and to the TC here was include in the stock market report the CO2 measures, because it's a way of identifying every day with the reality of the environmental violence that's around us. Now, for Gregor, he would just read it. But in the Times Colonist, or where you have these arrows, you can put an emotional valence to it. So if you look at the Globe and Mail, they have a little green box or a little red box with an upward pointing triangle or a downward pointing triangle. So I said, okay, you can use red and green. Well, we can also just use black and white, because the Times Colonist uses gray, so they may not want to spend the money on the color. But you could say up is white, down is black. And the message is, walk away. The message is, when CO2 is up, that's bad. Up is not good. Up is not good if you have cancer and you hear your cancer is up. That's not good. It's neither good here. So we have comparisons with, because carbon in the atmosphere has a seasonal periodicity to it, you would compare to the same day previous year, right, rather than yesterday. So you would say, carbon dioxide measured as measured in Mauna Loa, 410.95, that's up 1.38 parts per million since last year. At the same time, it's a 0.33% increase. And the TSX is also up 620 say, up, zero point 0.7 points, and so, and I proposed to CBC, and I wrote to Jack Knox, because he had written, just about a bit ago, or more than a month, almost like 2 months ago, he'd written a very nice column on climate change. No reply from CBC, no reply from Jack Knox. I wrote to Dave Obey, the editor, and I said, just put it in on Earth Day, without any commentary, no editorializing. Just let's see what happens if one day you put a CO2 measure in with the stock market reports. I finally, after 4 emails to CBC Victoria, I got a reply from Madeleine Green, the producer. I had one conversation with her. I haven't heard from her again. So in some ways, the story is there's no story, right? That these, as much as CBC talks about the climate crisis, climate emergency here in the on the CRD, none of them want to talk about it. And I've written Madeleine saying maybe this is a decision you can't make. Maybe this is like a higher pay grade scale. You can't mess with the stock market reports. But not getting a reply is not satisfactory. So I've got one of our Meek alumni who brings his child to the same daycare that Gregor Craigie does. So you use whatever connections you can, and I'm hoping to talk with Gregor about this. I just this morning got an email back from Bob McDonald, Quirks and Quarks, who finally replied, but he said talk to Madeleine Green, so I'm going to talk, and Bob lives over in Fairfield, and in James Bay we get passports and we can go to Fairfield, so I'm going to try to go maybe talk with him. But to me, this is a very simple way of making visible this problem, that there's a tight correlation between GDP, country GDP, and carbon emissions. And what the Paris Agreement says is we have to decouple this rapidly. We have to allow GDP to grow and carbon measures to decrease. And right now they're tightly correlated. So this just reminds a very particular audience. We're not talking to teenagers here. We're talking to business people who look at the stock markets every morning and reminding them that when the CO2 is up, that's not good. I have a paper, I hope they'll publish it, a little blog. Maybe some of you know The Conversation. I got the last draft was yesterday, so maybe I'll hear from them, and maybe that'll be a way of beginning to open that up. But I think this is the only measure we have that is recorded on a daily basis that would be comparable to the stock market. And it's a little way of making visible this other thing that's rather invisible. So that's my present little advocacy project. But anyways, so thank you for coming.